For some time, one of the most effective ways climate deniers created doubt was to talk about how there had been no global warming for 18 years, or 15 years, or 7 years, or however long they thought they could get away with. This reached a peak in hearings before the U.S. Senate held by Texas Senator Ted Cruz.
Chart on the right, which shows for the last 18 years that there's been no significant warming whatsoever. Now that's directly contrary to what the data set showed.
The data in Senator Cruz's graph is satellite data for the troposphere, about the bottom 5 miles of the atmosphere. It's from Remote Sensing Systems, also known as RSS. If we estimate the trend during that time period, it's quite flat. Of course, that's only an estimate of the trend, so it's uncertain if this time span is all you look at. If you ignore everything else, then it might be warming, it might be cooling, but the estimate itself is flat. But, and this is a big but, we should not ignore everything else. We shouldn't ignore what has happened in the years since. And we shouldn't ignore what happened before the start of that graph either, or how that affects the estimated trend. Even if we do ignore what came before and what happened since, we certainly shouldn't ignore data for the surface temperature where we live, whether that surface temperature data comes from NASA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the Hadley Center Climate Research Unit in the UK, or from Cowton and Way at the University of York, or from the Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Project. And we shouldn't ignore what happened before and since in those surface temperature data sets. If we still insist on ignoring what happened before and since, we should not ignore the decline of sea ice in the Arctic, or the stunning melting of the Greenland ice sheet, or the heating of the depths of the oceans, or the continued rise of sea level. But Ted Cruz wants to ignore those things, all of them. The only thing he wants to talk about is the one data set he can find that looks like no warming, for the one time span he can find that looks like no warming. But he'll still accuse climate scientists, who he calls alarmists, of wanting to avoid talking about the satellite data.
I understand that the global warming alarmists don't want to talk about the satellite data, but I'm asking.
Satellite. Let's talk about the satellite measurements. Let's talk about orbital decay. Let's talk about overlapping satellite records. Let's talk about stratospheric temperature contamination.
That was Rear Admiral David Titley, USN retired, former Chief Oceanographer of the United States Navy. He wants to talk about the satellite data, but about more than just the fact that you can find an 18-year period when it looks like there's no warming. So do Carl Mears and Frank Wentz. They're two of those Senator Cruz refers to when he says alarmists. They're also the main scientists who publish the RSS data for temperature in the troposphere. And they're very concerned with orbital decay and the overlapping satellite records and stratospheric temperature contamination. That's why they keep doing more research to make the data better. And just this year, they published some of their results. They've improved on the problem of drifting local measurements because of orbital uncertainty and overlapping satellite records. They even devised a way to remove much of the stratospheric temperature contamination, leading to a new version of their data, which they call TTT, for total troposphere temperature. With these improvements in place, their data show substantially increased global scale warming relative to the previous version. Imagine that. Ted Cruz wants to ignore all those things, whether it's improvements to the satellite data, or what happened before or after his cherry-picked time period, or surface temperature data, or ocean heat, or Arctic sea ice, or Greenland ice sheet melt, or earlier melting of the snowpack, or the rise in wildfire in the western U.S., or increasing heat waves around the world, or the rising cost of weather-related disasters worldwide, or flooding in Miami caused by sea level rise. Ted Cruz doesn't want you to know. But he's happy to call scientists alarmists and accuse them, some of whom create and study the satellite data, of not wanting to talk about the satellite data. And when 2016 turns out to be the third record-breaking hot year in a row, don't expect Ted Cruz to talk about that either, unless he resorts to calling the data a fraud.